trayectoria en materia constitucional y lo que la materia constitucional permite en Canadá en relación no solo con este país, sino también con otros países fuera de Canadá. Así que escucharemos con mucha atención sus participaciones y voy a darle la palabra al licenciado Víctor Candelas para que se la dé en el mismo sentido al profesor Jeremy Weber. Please.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Now we're about to start, and in this case, Professor Weber will start with the conference. Welcome, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for those generous introductions. Very, very grateful. I understand that the purpose of this forum is really to explore in comparative focus cultural diversity and politics in the countries of the region. And Canada has had a long experience with cultural diversity. It began as a diverse country. It remains that way. If one looks at the populations that have come to make up Canada over those years, one begins with the Indigenous peoples, themselves very diverse, the First Nations, many peoples of several different language families living in very different terrains, the Inuit in the far north, and joined by yet a third class of Indigenous peoples, the Métis, who were the result of a process of forming a people out of the period of interaction of the fur trade. One then also has, as the foundational European population of the territory, the French-speaking population, the population who are the descendants of the French colonists of Eastern Canada for about 150 years. The European presence in what is now Canada was predominantly French-speaking, overwhelmingly French-speaking. And still today, French is the language spoken at home of something like a quarter of the Canadian population. Of course, then there was the English-speaking population, now making up about 75% of the population of Canada. And then, of course, there are the various waves of immigrants, beginning, I imagine, with the French and the English, but especially beginning about the turn of the 20th century, extensive migration from other European countries, and then increasingly from Asia and from Africa, so that now in the most recent census, something like 22% of Canadians were at one time immigrants to Canada, were born outside of Canada. And of those in the most recent census, something like 48% are from Asia, 28% from Europe, 8.5% from Africa. So extensive diversity over time. And those relationships have been dynamic. They're not evenly spread across time or across the country. They've been dynamic through time. They've been dynamic geographically. Different sections of the country were settled by non-Indigenous populations at different times, different economic bases, different landscapes, different sources of immigration. And so, in fact, the Canadian experience is also a regionally diverse experience that has also been dynamic in its interactions. It's not as though these peoples have remained separate over the years. They interact, and the different forms of diversity have interacted as well. Thus, for example, Canada has two major public languages of interaction, French and English, and that differentiation has also intersected in interesting ways with the immigrant experience and with relations with Indigenous peoples. So a huge amount of complexity, differentiated across time and across Canada. And what I'd like to do is just give an overview of how those interactions have occurred in the broadest generality. Happy to answer questions later about any specifics. Also talk about some areas of current development. Where are those, what's happening in connection with those questions of diversity now? And then Amanda will take us deep into the immigrant experience today, especially the experience of temporary workers, of a variety of contemporary challenges that Canada is facing, and we hope will meet with the wisdom and the generosity that lies behind this forum. So I guess an overview of Canadian cultural politics might look like this. For a very long time, and still today, the interaction of French and English has been a dominant force within Canadian politics. That is a regionally differentiated presence. So the French-speaking population is concentrated within the province of Quebec and the areas of the surrounding provinces that adjoined the province of Quebec. It's a substantial presence within Canada. Approximately 25% of Canadians today speak French at home. It has also been a fact that ever since the British conquest in 1759, 1760, it has really felt the demographic pressure within North America, a sense that without a concerted attempt to retain that heritage, it could be eroded in a North America where the dominant language is English. And in that desire to maintain French language and culture within Canada, the province of Quebec has been very important as a crucial homeland for the French fact within Canada and within North America. The one jurisdiction in North America in which French is the predominant language of political interaction, the predominant language of social interaction. And especially with the potential for that presence to be eroded, there have been measures taken by the Quebec government to protect the use of French within Quebec, especially beginning in the 1970s, measures to ensure that in large enterprises, French was the language of interaction, to have the face of Quebec be visibly French by requiring that French be predominant on commercial signs, and a variety of regulations that deal with the use of French in public services. There has been a movement for independence within Quebec. Two important referenda on Quebec's potential independence have been held. One in 1980, 60% of Quebec's population rejected independence in that referendum. Also, a second one in 1995, where the division between the yes and the no was less than 1%. So it was very close. It was rejected, but rejected by less than 1%. So hugely important fact in the political life of Canada. The French fact has also been important at the federal level of government, the government of all Canadians, which operates bilingually. Now that itself is a relatively recent development. Until the late 1960s, 1970s, the federal government operated overwhelmingly in English. But as part of an attempt to make sure that the federal government could serve as the government of all Canadians, it adopted a strong orientation towards bilingualism that continues today. Now, I should say when we talk about French language populations in Canada, we're not talking about people of French ethnic origin necessarily. So French, as the predominant language of interaction in Quebec, has also been the language often, not always, often though, adopted by immigrant communities, especially, for example, communities from immigrants from Latin America. In fact, often the similarities in language, though of course different, but similarities, the civil law tradition within Quebec has made Quebec a welcome home for immigrants from countries from Southern Europe or from Latin America. There also are, although most Indigenous peoples, including in Quebec, have predominantly used English as their European language, there are also First Nations, Indigenous peoples in Quebec who use French as their European language. The Huron, for example, the Innu. So that's the importance of the kind of relationship of French and English within Canadian kind of cultural politics, if you will. But of course, immigration has often been important, hugely important. Canada is a country of immigration in substantial measure. First, a country of, as Canada, a country of colonization, but then a country of immigration. And that too has posed its challenges that Canada has confronted, sometimes met well, sometimes met not so well. Those challenges have been oriented towards the achievement of greater equality for people of non-English, non-French background, a desire for inclusion, full inclusion as citizens, as participants in Canadian society, an orientation then in substantial measure different from the French-speaking population of Quebec, which has sought to have a homeland in which French could be used as a public language. For most immigrants to Canada, the desire has been to become a full member of Canadian society. Differentiation still, but more in a private sphere, and a desire for inclusion, equality, non-discrimination being the predominant orientation of immigrants. And those experiences have occurred at different times across the country, different force in some parts of the country, especially on the prairies. Waves of immigration have been the dominant non-Indigenous characteristic of the population of the provinces in the Prairie West. I guess, though, it's fair to say, though, that increasingly immigration tends to be felt as an urban phenomenon, a predominantly urban phenomenon, although it also has a strong rural dimension and interesting differentiation between the rural and the urban interactions. But then I guess the other kind of cultural phenomenon or cultural characteristic of Canada that has been hugely important and increasingly important, especially important, I would say, since the 1970s, a huge dimension of the constitutional politics of Canada, and that's the interaction with Indigenous peoples. A realization, a grudging realization, but a realization among Canadian, non-Indigenous Canadians that they must do better in the interaction with Indigenous peoples themselves strongly asserting their right to remain Indigenous, their right to retain control of their lands, their right to participate in their own governments, as well as in the broader Canadian society. And so there have been huge engagement with questions of Aboriginal title to land, still unresolved, still ongoing within Canada, and a modern treaty process that came out of that engagement with Aboriginal title, not yet completed. Still many Indigenous peoples without secure authority with respect to Indigenous lands. There are issues with respect to those people who have had treaty, especially the historical treaties, and whether those treaties have been respected, whether they've been interpreted in a way that was faithful to the original understandings. So huge questions there. And then leading towards very, very much an important aspect of the contemporary reality, rebuilding Indigenous governments, Indigenous control over their lands, Indigenous ability to control their own communities, build their own economies. So today, I guess, where do these stand? I think one might say this. So in Quebec, after having had the question of Quebec's possible movement towards independence be such an important part of Canadian politics for, 40 years, 50 years, most Francophone Quebecers not wanting to go there, but wanting to make sure that they have a secure and respected place within Canada. I think now it's the case that sovereignty is largely off the table. Who knows for how long, but the main sovereignist parties have not done well in recent elections, and the current government is a nationalist government, conservative nationalist government, but that has made clear that it will not hold a referendum on independence. So the question of independence has been put on the shelf, but the protection of French remains an important dimension, and there have been recent tensions about the protection of French within Canada, and a question about how welcoming Quebec is to immigrants. A desire to be welcoming. It is not an unwelcoming society, but with an orientation colored by the French doctrine of laïcité, with an idea that that welcome may have to be on terms that, for example, prohibit the wearing of the hijab. And so a debate that has been colored by hostility to difference, as well as by a French conception of citizenship that keeps religion out of the public square, and a complex mixture of the two. It's but a mixture that has been hard for those women from communities where the hijab is worn, who find themselves now excluded from public employment in many areas. For Indigenous peoples, in the engagement with Indigenous people, the questions of the reconciliation with Indigenous peoples has only grown over time since the 1970s. The most recent was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 2015, and followed up by an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that has had a huge impact on the non-Indigenous population. What that will result in, we don't know yet, but nevertheless. And so with that combined with Indigenous resurgence by Indigenous peoples themselves to govern their communities, to exercise stewardship over their lands, to live by their law, has been huge. And of course, with respect to recent immigrants, non-English, non-French, there continue to be challenges with questions of inclusion and equality. Canada, I think it's fair to say, don't know whether Amanda would agree with this, has not had the anti-immigrant, kind of the virulent anti-immigrant politics that one has seen in some societies, but it's not perfect either. One of the expressions of that imperfection is the question about whether the secure pathway to citizenship that once existed for immigrants, that was really responsible for, in many ways, for the expansion of the non-Indigenous population of Canada, whether that still exists. And for many people it doesn't, as I know Amanda will say. So without further ado, I'll pass the torch to Amanda.
Thank you very
so
much, Professor Jeremy Weber. Really, what you've told us, it's quite important. As an immigrant society, Canada knows from different experiences what the encounter of different cultures are. And this is based on the immigration, different languages. And I would like you to question if what could be, in this case, the achievements that, for instance, the Quebec people has given to Canada. Main achievements, cultural achievements.
Well, they are so extensive that it's difficult even to say what they are. Canada would not be the same country were it not for the presence of Quebec within Canada. To take one example, Canada did not participate in the Iraq War that was led by the United States and was joined by other countries like Australia, like Britain. Canada did not participate, and I'm sure the reason it did not participate is because of the presence of Quebec within Canada. So Quebec's presence has shaped Canada's political life in a whole range of different ways. It also means that Canada really participates in deeply in two great European cultures, let alone the contributions from all of the other cultures that have come. But Quebec is a civil law jurisdiction, and a very vigorous civil law jurisdiction, one where it has developed approaches, for example, to the recognition of trusts within the civil law that have been drawn considerable attention in Europe as well. So it's, and it has its own literature, it has its own music, it has had its own, it would be difficult to mention a Canadian contribution that the French dimension of Canada hadn't also contributed to and put its own particular spin on.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeremy Weber. Le hice la pregunta al profesor Jeremy Weber en torno a lo que Quebec, que es una provincia que siempre ha mostrado, por un lado, digamos, una cultura diferente. En Quebec, las lenguas predominantes son el francés y el inglés, aunque en las migraciones ya más recientes, pues ha habido, por lo mismo, la presencia de otros idiomas, ¿no? Ha habido inmigrantes de Asia, de África y de América Latina. Entonces, pues esto obviamente modifica el panorama lingüístico y cultural de Canadá, que es, como decía el profesor Jeremy Weber, un país de inmigrantes. Y esto, claro, dinamiza en muchas formas la propia cultura y las políticas mismas de Canadá, porque la manera de visualizar, de pensar, de asumir realidades que cruzan Canadá, pues es diferente desde unas posiciones y otras, desde los mismos habitantes de Quebec, porque pues significa en términos lingüísticos una cuarta parte de los idiomas que se hablan en Quebec, y esto pues naturalmente influye en términos generales en la propia cultura y en la política de todo Canadá. El profesor Weber me ha respondido que precisamente pues se ha dado este aporte de Quebec, no se podría medir en cuántas formas y medida, que sería imposible, pero sí que ha sido en muy diversas formas en las que Quebec, esta provincia que ha mostrado tendencias independentistas, le ha producido a Canadá en términos generales, y de Canadá ha podido obtener una respuesta de alguna manera no correspondiente a lo que en las tendencias independentistas hay debajo, ¿no? Es decir, deseos de una mayor inclusividad, de mayores posibilidades de elevar el nivel de vida, etcétera. Entonces, bueno, pues esto es lo que hemos escuchado así de una manera muy sintética en torno a la intervención del profesor Weber. Y ahora daremos el uso de la palabra a la abogada Amanda Aziz para que nos dé su punto de vista sobre nuestro tema. Por favor, Amanda.
Gracias. Thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor for me to participate in this forum and also to follow Professor Weber. So I am going to speak about migration more specifically, partly because it's my work, and also, as you've heard Professor Weber speak about, it is historically and obviously contemporaneous, or still a very contemporary issue in Canada, and something that impacts, our everyday culture and politics. I would say, just to jump onto the question that you just answered in terms of Quebec and its influence, there is also quite a big influence that Quebec has on Canada's immigration system, and specifically the new programs and new pathways to permanent residence and citizenship are often heavily influenced by Quebec and whether or not Quebec will get on board with certain public policies the government wants to institute with respect to migration. And one of the sort of primary issues confronting the country, and particularly Quebec right now, is an influx of asylum claimants specifically into Quebec, which happens to be, I think, both because of geography and the ability to cross the land border there, but also because of an influx of French-speaking refugee claimants from countries like Haiti and some French-speaking African countries. It's also often more simple to get to the United States as a temporary resident than to Canada in order to cross the land border to make a refugee claim in Canada. So we often see people crossing irregularly between the United States and Canada in order to seek Canada's protection. I'm actually going to spend more time talking about migrant workers, but I just thought I would add that tidbit in. My own work in this field is influenced by my own immigration story and my family's immigration story. Both my parents were part of the influx of immigrants in the 1970s, my father from Egypt and my mother from Hungary. And what I would say is that the immigration system that I think they were confronted with, that was very welcoming and very easy for them to both get citizenship in Canada, has, in my view, and especially based on the work that I do, shifted quite a bit in terms of the very picky way that Canada has become with who we consider ideal immigrants, who we consider deserving of permanent status in our country, and who we choose to make up and to welcome in our country and this Canadian fabric. And I do want to just reiterate, and it's something that Professor Weber talked about, of course, that as a country of migrants, we do have a very disturbing colonial history, and it's an ongoing colonial. There are many ongoing colonial projects that are happening, of course, both in Canada and across the Americas. And it's something that is a tension for me in my work every day, just trying to understand, can we have an immigration system that takes into consideration and truly respects the Indigenous nations of this country? And it's not something I have an answer to, but something I put out there in terms of something that's important and on my mind. The thing I want to focus on mostly has to do with the temporary nature of most migration to Canada these days, and the shift that has been away from permanent migration over the last 20, 30 years into keeping migrants more temporary, and specifically temporary foreign workers. And in the last 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, the number of temporary foreign workers in Canada has quadrupled, for example. And it's been a persistent shift away from permanent status for some people to a shift towards much more temporary status. Right now, as Professor Weber had spoken about or talked about, the majority of migrants to Canada predominantly come from South Asia, India, China. The Philippines is a huge source country, though there are many, many temporary workers, of course, coming from the Americas, with the largest amount of agricultural workers in Canada coming from Mexico. About almost half, or just less than half, of workers who work in food production in Canada who are migrant workers come from Mexico. In 2021, that meant around 27,000 farm workers from Mexico. Guatemala is the second highest source country of migrant farm workers in Canada. And unfortunately, that has meant that a lot of workers from the Americas are also subject to some terrible working conditions, which I will speak about in a moment. I also just want to acknowledge that this shift to temporary status and the sort of drivers of migration and Canada's role, I think, in that drive. As a receiving country, there are many drivers, of course, of migration that include neoliberalism, ongoing colonialism in many countries, and a global economic inequality that Canada benefits from. And I think that our temporary foreign worker program, unfortunately, also sort of relies on, because of the kinds of works that people are coming to do, and many of the jobs are not in industries that Canadians or permanent residents are willing to do anymore. And I guess just the paradox here in terms of, Canada's also contribution to foreign policy that can contribute to this economic inequality and our benefits of migrant labor. The government is currently focused very much on labor shortages, and I know this isn't just a Canadian phenomenon. Right now, there are many discussions ongoing with respect to the shortage of workers in Canada, the labor shortages that we have across many industries. And it is predominantly in industries that we rely heavily on migrant labor. So food production, healthcare, hospitality, and tourism. Many of these, what I would call lower waged migrant workers, face discrimination and dangerous working conditions in Canada on a daily basis. And many of them are unable to access union representation or participate in the broader labor movements in Canada. More disturbingly, the legal structures in Canada with respect to our temporary workers make foreign workers very reliant on their employers for immigration status. also for their housing, and sometimes, and most often, for their long-term ability to stay in Canada and to bring their families to accompany them. And it's created, I would say, from my view, from the work that I do, a bit of a tiered system of workers' rights, a tiered system of your ability to access and enforce basic labor rights, depending on your residence, depending on your permanency in the country. The majority of workers who come to Canada, migrant workers, and what I would say is the paramount source of vulnerability of these workers is that we've restricted most migrant workers' ability to change employers when they come to Canada. So the majority of workers come to Canada with an authorization or a permit to work for only one specific employer. It ties them to that employer, ties them to a location, ties them to a specific kind of work, and a specific time period that the worker is authorized to stay in Canada. And of course, this restriction creates an immense power imbalance between the worker and their employer, and more than exists with Canadian workers. Any change in a worker's work authorization requires prior approval, and that process can be really lengthy and often leaves workers in a very vulnerable position. If they're in an abusive working situation, waiting for that kind of authorization before you can leave your place of employment, or leaving before you have that authorization, can put you at a risk of deportation from Canada for failure to abide by the conditions of your work authorization. And this inability of workers to freely, or migrant workers, I would say, to freely circulate in our labor market leaves migrant workers in a very vulnerable position. There are judgments from various levels of Canadian courts who have found migrant workers to be among the most economically exploited and politically neutralized individuals in Canadian society. A study that the association that I work for conducted earlier this year examined the case of 30 workers who were being exploited, migrant workers who were being exploited across 3 industries, particularly in home care, farm workers, and restaurant workers. And we found that over 96% of the workers that we interacted with and assisted faced some sort of financial abuse, including in the form of unpaid wages, excessive work time, and being forced to repay a portion of their wages to their employers. 70% of those workers also experienced psychological abuse from their employers, including threats of deportation and racism. And 30% of the workers reported having experienced physical abuse, and disturbingly 10% of the workers also reported sexual abuse by their employers. So although migrant workers, like Canadian workers, do have, in theory, the same right to provincial labor and human rights standards as all workers, they're very extremely unlikely to enforce any of those rights because of this tie to their employers and because of this threat of removal from Canada. And the recruitment of workers, I would say, is also of particular interest, particularly in this forum, where we often hear of workers coming from other countries having paid very high recruitment fees or paying agents to be able to assist them with work to come to Canada, or assist them with passage to Canada, and arriving only to horrendous working conditions or a lack of employment, but being unable to do anything about it because Canada sometimes washes our hands of what's happening outside of our borders with these workers. So I'm a bit more pessimistic about what's happening with our current immigration systems. I'll just conclude by talking a bit about, I think there is a paradox in our country, in Canada, with respect to what I would agree with what Professor Weber said in terms of a support for immigration. I do think that our government, especially our current government, has been very conscious of trying to distance themselves from what is seen as, or what is more commonly associated with the US and this sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And, our political landscape does seem to be very supportive of immigrants, supportive of refugees, although there has been quite a bit of anti-migration rhetoric, I would say, in terms of policy design and the legal structures that that still favor temporary migration over permanence. The majority of the low-paid workers that I'm referring to, or that come to Canada to fill essential roles, often there is no pathway to permanent residence for these workers. So you'll hear of workers coming from Mexico, from Guatemala, from many of the other countries in the Americas, coming for 30 years, working on farms and returning to their countries without any feasible way for them to gain any sort of permanent status inside of Canada. Today, just today, actually, the Parliament, government tabled its annual report to Parliament on immigration and on its immigration levels. So, in the same side that we're seeing, or on the one hand, we're seeing the sort of shift to temporary nature, reliance on temporary workers, or reliance on this exploitable group of workers who can't enforce their labor rights. We also see a government who's very committed to increasing the level of permanent immigrants. The report that was tabled today is the most aggressive immigration levels, I think, in the history of Canada in terms of the amount of new immigrants the government is hoping for over the next 3 years. But again, as I said in the beginning, and I think what Professor Weber alluded to too, we've become a lot more picky about what we call the so-called ideal immigrant, and who we provide pathways to in terms of people's ability to or I think the way that our immigration system values things like self-sufficiency and, this so-called hardworking kind of immigrant. And so, that paradox continues to exist. I do think Canadians, there have been some recent polls conducted among Canadians just this week showing increasing support favoring increasing immigration levels. But again, I think that a contributor to this is likely our very picky and ever increasingly difficult migration system, and the difficulty, the difference in 30 years ago accessing citizenship and immigration to Canada, as opposed to present day immigration and the complex legal system that one must weave their way through. I'll leave it at that, just so we have some time for discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for that information. So it brings out many questions about immigration over there, because what I can tell you from this side, like from Mexico, it still happens that we see ads all over the place that tell us, hey, move to Canada, we're looking for you and all that. But it seems that is not the case anymore, not for everyone, I guess, depending on certain requisites that they need to accomplish, right? But I would like to ask you both a question that has to do more with the way the mixture of cultures happens over there. Because what I've noticed, at least from the US perspective, because I lived there for a little bit, what I noticed is that the woke culture, it's taking over. But I've seen that woke culture is also working its way in Canada. I don't know if you could work a little bit of that on this. Jeremy, you're
Yes,
the
I'd be
winner.
happy to answer it. Although Amanda will probably have the better answer. I think one of the things that's implicit in what Amanda said, or explicit really, I guess, is that we use the same term to refer to temporary immigrants, temporary migrants, and to permanent migrants. But they really are treated profoundly differently within Canadian society. The people who satisfy the point system to come as immigrants into permanent residency are still seen as being the future citizens of Canada, and at least ideally, officially, and in policy, able to enjoy all of the rights of citizenship. Temporary workers, I think it's fair to say, are just not seen as part of the Canadian community. kind of omnipresent, but invisible, but invisible as outsiders, people here temporarily, who don't have the same attention from the law, don't have the same sense of being permanent contributors to the Canadian. The work they do is essential, but they're not seen as people who will be given a right to stay. And it's profoundly different from the basis on which my Scottish ancestors came. They were impoverished. They came as impoverished farmers, but with an expectation that they would be here forever. And as Amanda described so eloquently, we now have a situation where that kind of immigration is not welcomed except to plug holes in our labor force on a temporary basis. And as soon as the growing season is over, they should return to their homes. I don't know, Amanda doubtless has things to add.
No, I mean, I agree. And I think another thing that I just think is interesting for us to interrogate is just the values that are reflected in those points, in that point system. And, you know, what people are getting points for and what we value in terms of that ideal immigrant. And I bring it back to this idea around, you know, our colonial history and the first peoples of this country, and, you know, whose values are being reflected in that immigration system. And, you know, and I think not even just about the first peoples of this country, but also, you know, now this mosaic of different cultures we have in Canada, whose values are being reflected in that immigration system, and is that still reflective of our society?
Thanks a lot, Amanda. Voy a hacer un breve comentario sobre lo que ha expuesto la abogada Amanda Aziz. Ella ha hablado sobre el trato diferente que se da a los inmigrantes según su origen, sus habilidades, digamos un poco su nivel de escolaridad acaso, y también su situación en el mundo laboral de Canadá. Es decir, que si son temporales, pues posiblemente no sean considerados de la misma manera que los trabajadores que tienen ya un nivel de posible residencia canadiense y que por lo mismo pues se los ve como futuros conciudadanos. Y de esa manera, bueno, pues ciertamente hay incluso abusos sobre los inmigrantes que van en las condiciones más vulnerables, abusos de todo tipo, ¿no? Desde abusos sexuales, abusos económicos, restricciones políticas, en fin, ¿no? Esto, bueno, creo que forma parte precisamente de una de las grandes tendencias mundiales producidas precisamente por la globalización. La globalización que no fue sino una nueva expansión del capitalismo, produjo en los diferentes países, sobre todo en los países considerados dentro del subdesarrollo o de otra manera con nombres diferentes, ¿no? Países emergentes, esto, pues produjo condiciones de pobreza y de inseguridad. Entonces, esto no lo han querido aceptar ciertamente los países desarrollados plenamente, pero hay una causa. Ayer veíamos esto en la mesa sobre México. Pues de México tenemos 15 millones, alrededor de 14 millones de expulsados propiamente del país porque se van a Estados Unidos a buscar pues la manera de poder proveer a sus necesidades básicas y a poder tener un posible futuro. Pero aquí miren, es muy interesante el fenómeno de la migración porque nosotros lo conocemos casi nada más que por ciertas noticias, apenas vemos que, por ejemplo, aquí en Monterrey ha habido migrantes haitianos, pero todo eso un poco ocurre lejos de nuestras propias experiencias, ¿no? El hecho de que Amanda sea hija de un egipcio y una mujer húngara, eso quiere decir mucho, porque eso creo que a ella la ha dotado de una mirada muy aguda, muy penetrante acerca de lo que ha sido su compromiso, no solo profesional, sino un compromiso de vida, ¿no? Entonces, creo que nosotros tenemos que modificar nuestra mirada sobre los migrantes, porque todo pueblo que puede tener la posibilidad de crecer sobre las bases de un mestizaje, es decir, de la mezcla de unos individuos con otros, con diferentes culturas, con diferentes costumbres, con diferentes maneras de ver y de traducir a su lengua otras culturas y otras lenguas, pues eso naturalmente enriquece. A los mexicanos esto no nos debiera parecer extraño, porque nosotros somos producto de un gran mestizaje, ¿no? De los europeos que vienen y nos conquistan y nos colonizan, pero que su presencia produce un mestizaje con los grupos originarios que estaban, pues, que habitaban en el antiguo territorio mexicano. Bueno, antiguo simplemente lo fue siempre, pero por el nombre cambió, ¿no? Y desde luego por el nuevo tipo de sociedad que inaugurara pues la presencia de los europeos en nuestro país. Pero ciertamente, esto que nos explican tanto el profesor Weber como Amanda, debemos tomarlo muy en cuenta, porque nosotros somos receptores también de migrantes, y creo que nuestra mirada en torno a los migrantes debe modificarse, si es que no se ha modificado, ¿no? En algunos, porque el trato que les damos no es el trato que debiéramos darle a cualquier ser humano, ¿no? Es decir, esto no es cuestión de países, no es cuestión de fronteras, no es cuestión tampoco de nuestros propios lugares donde nacimos, crecemos, etcétera, y donde lo que nos circunscribe pues es una pequeña frontera, y fuera de esa frontera no queremos saber de nadie más que de aquellos que vemos cotidianamente. Entonces, esto creo que debe ser una lección para todos nosotros en ese sentido. Pues les vamos a agradecer muchísimo su participación, tanto a Amanda como al profesor Weber, ¿no? Por su participación, y desde luego si hay alguna pregunta, pues se contestará rápidamente. Le dejo yo la voz al licenciado Víctor Manuel Candelas.
Gracias, maestro. Ok. Bueno, sí, si hay alguna pregunta que quieran realizar para los ponentes, la pueden mandar a través del mensaje y con gusto se las realizaremos. Mientras tanto, voy a hacer aquí un pequeño agradecimiento, en este caso pues en inglés y en español, presentando un certificado de agradecimiento y reconocimiento tanto para Jeremy Weber y Amanda Aziz. What I was saying is that I'm just going to present right now a little token of appreciation as a thank you for being with us today. Just let me know if you can see it. It's right there. Oh. It's a little certificate. It's a token as a thank you for participating in the Forum of the Americas about politics and culture. In this case, letting us know and learn about Canada is for both you, Amanda Aziz, and also for Jeremy Weber. I hope you can see it right now.
Yes.
If you do, I'd appreciate. And well, we'll make sure to let it get to you through email, at least digitally for now, and hopefully one day we would be able to give it to you in person, right? And well, once again, I want to say thank you so much for everything. I guess the audience is a little bit shy today. They don't have any questions around there. But it was a great conference. We learned a lot about the situation in Canada, especially about migration over there and how people, keeps going and coming all the time. So once again, thank you so much. Let me just ask Maestro Abraham if he has any other questions. If not, I think we're good to say goodbye. Maestro, no sé si hay alguna otra pregunta, si no ya nos podemos despedir.
No, simplemente decirles gracias. La verdad es que estamos muy agradecidos con su participación. Professor Jamie Weber, Amanda Aziz, already an old friend. We thank you a lot, your participation, and this is a very important lesson for us, because what at least in our center we think is that the mixture of people, it's also a principle of vigorization of a society. So thank you very much, and we see forward to meet you again, even for this medium, all right?
Yes.
Goodbye.
Yes.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. Well, thank you so much and have a great day.
Nice
Muchas
to-
gracias a todos. El Centro de Estudios Parlamentarios les da las gracias por su presencia en el Fórum de las Américas sobre Política y Cultura, tendencias globales y locales en Canadá. Amanda, thank you. Jeremy, thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adiós.
Yes.